My name is Laura Perna. I really am so pleased and privileged to have the opportunity to chair this lunchtime conversation. I thank Bill for asking me to do this. He reluctantly agreed to participate, but I'm glad that he agreed to do so. He's clearly been very visible at this meeting, being the president of AERA, and I hope you have a sense of his passion and values. But through this session, I hope that you'll also learn a little bit about some of his scholarship as well. The overall purpose of this session is to try to make transparent how a program of research about a complex and large problem evolves over time. I'm particularly interested in having a conversation about how there are just multiple research methods and research approaches that are important to trying to deconstruct and understand these large problems. You have the bios for the three of us. Bill, president of AERA, professor at the University of Southern California. This is Elisa Cunningham, vice president for research at the Institute for Higher Education Policy here in Washington, D.C. One problem that all three of us care about is increasing college access and success for students from underrepresented groups. Clearly, we've had improvements in college access and success over time, but there are large and important problems that remain, particularly when we think about equity and outcomes across groups. So college access and completion rates continue to be substantially lower for students from low-income families and racial ethnic minority groups, students who are first-generation college students. And there's a lot of complexity to understanding why these gaps have persisted over time, especially when we have so many different public policies and institutional practices devoted to trying to solve these issues. So just briefly, my program of research on these topics has evolved over time, and when I look back on it, I'm not sure it was as conscious as I was going through it. It really mirrors my career projection or progression. So pre-tenure, my research focused on trying to model quantitatively using existing large-scale data sets how students of different groups make decisions about enrolling in college. And I did a whole host of different quantitative analyses trying to understand different dimensions of this problem from that perspective. The second stage coincided with getting tenure after tenure. My questions started to change and really trying to understand, well, how do these public policies and practices actually play out in real life in the context of high schools? And so the large project that occurred then was looking at what's happening within 15 different high schools, 3 in each of 5 states, and understanding how students, parents, teachers, school counselors make sense of different aspects of the college access decision-making process. The third phase coincided with after getting promotion to full. I'm trying to understand the ways that state public policy are related to improving college access and attainment, and the large project that coincided with that is case studies of 5 different states and trying to understand the relationship between public policy and educational attainment and gaps in equity across groups. Now I'm trying to think about the fourth stage, and I think it's thinking about how these things play out in different contexts, particularly with regard to the international context, and to what extent what we know in the U.S. context is similar to and different from what happens in other nations. So that's just a brief description of how I've tried to understand these issues. I'd like to pass it along to Elisa to talk about how her approach to these issues has evolved over time.
Hi, everybody. For those of you who don't know about IHEB, we're located here in D.C. We are what you would call a policy research organization, nonprofit, nonpartisan. We're very small, and we work on a lot of different topics, all related to higher education policy issues that are important. And so our audience tends to be policymakers, people on campus, various practitioners, policymakers at the state level or at the government level or federal government level, and that kind of thing. And so when we publish, we're really focused on making something user-friendly, easy to read, that policymakers can digest very quickly. But The way we do that is a little bit different than academic research. So although we're still using the context of academic research, we are drilling down and making this more digestible to folks who will be reading it, and we hope that will inform that process. So as I've been at IHEP for about 15 years now, and it has started, we really started in financial aid and financing of college, and so my career actually started that way as well. So I did quite a bit of work looking at different types of topics, looking at private student loans, for example, as well as looking at the costs and prices in higher education institutions in a study for the Department of Education. But IHEP as a whole, as we have moved through and thinking about access in particular, when we're talking to policymakers, there's three ways we've kind of gone about that. One of them is conceptual. We want policymakers and practitioners to understand the concepts behind access. So for example, we put together a publication called What is Opportunity? How do you define opportunity? What does it mean for different groups of students within higher education or who are accessing higher education for the first time? Another way that we've approached that issue is to look at trends over time. And what do students look like? What types of students? How have their barriers to higher education changed over time? What does that mean for policymakers as they think about writing policies or making decisions at a campus level? And the third way we've addressed the issue of access is to focus on very particular topics in research, such as the barriers to higher education for working poor students or to incarcerated students, which are subsets, but where you can actually make a very direct policy impact because we're not looking at access as a whole, which can be a little bit overwhelming when you're talking to a policymaker, but thinking about this particular group that can actually be impacted and make a difference for a very specific population. So those are three different ways that I've approached that. And I think by doing that, we've been able to kind of really move forward some of these questions, tricky questions that you may see in the academic literature that filter down into the policy research space.
Thank you. Bill?
You know, after my postdoc, after graduate school, I went to Penn State for my job interview, and the dean was the last guy to talk to me. And he said to me, looking at your resume, you've been in the Peace Corps, you worked in a Native American reservation, you've done these different things, you did an ethnography. He said, you look like a bit of a dilettante. And I said, I don't take that as a compliment. I don't think you mean it as a compliment, but I'll take it as one. Well, I'm still here, and he's long gone. But I do think that it's hard sometimes when people look at the trajectory of my work, how does it fit together? So let me, since I'm older than both of them, Laura and Alyssa, let me run through this, just how I've gotten to where I'm at. And I need to link this to funding agents as well, because they have helped frame, and I mean that in a positive way as opposed to a negative way. When I moved from Penn State to USC, California had just eliminated affirmative action. And the question for me was, if you eliminate a policy and you still hold to the belief of the policy, then what do you do? And if we are still concerned about access and equity for low-income, first-generation youth and students of color, what do we do? So I got money from the Ford Foundation to really put together a taxonomy of college preparation programs. And at that time, there was just an alphabet soup of everything, in and out, before, after. And what I learned is that because they were all on soft funding, they were all remarkably successful. Because if you didn't say that you had 90% success rate, you wouldn't get money to stay in the business. So we needed to think about that. I then got money from the Department of Education, where I did a study of one particular program in terms of indicators of effectiveness, MESA, the Math, Engineering, Science Achievement. And we put together something on indicators of effectiveness. But really my area is higher education. So I received funding from the Atlantic Philanthropies to try to understand what's the role of the university in fomenting college access, not simply what schools should do, but what should universities do, and how do we create effective relationships. The Lumina Foundation came through and they asked me to think about what is a college-going culture for high school students, what does that mean, and what's the role of universities in that. But somewhere along the line, or actually most of my life, I've been concerned about this idea of praxis, and in my center we work with 10 low-income schools. Dropout rates are north of 50%, college-going rates are south of 30%. So what I realized is that there are students in those schools today who could go to college. And they don't go to college because the counselor-to-student ratio in California is 800 to 1. So what I thought was, if we created a mentoring program, that we could help kids in these schools go to college. And that's what we've done. And I work with these students as well. But then we realized that once they graduate from an institution and they are accepted, they go to a 4-year institution, the remedial rate for writing, and people have asked me at times, why am I looking at writing rather than math? I majored in English. So, the 60% of students who go to Cal State University have to take remedial writing or math. It's the same, it's less numbers at the UC system, but it's still bad. Who are the students who are caught behind that? It's the students that we work with. So I created a writing program, and it's in the summer. We have 5 weeks, 5 hours a day, 4 hours on writing, a 5th hour on what we call college knowledge. And both of these, my assumption was that if we're successful, these are going to scale up because California is that sort of state. Well, 2 things happened along the way. We are successful. The Kauffman Foundation gave us money to look at good governance of college as well. But the state funded us, Goldman Sachs funded us, and we were able to scale up within particular parameters. But I found that I was all of a sudden, like what I had just said, I'm after soft funding. What I found, however, was with the mentoring program, that that's really not scalable. I am interested in working with people, but I want also to do research that enables us to expand. And we couldn't do that. The writing program, however, is scalable. So we've gotten money from Goldman Sachs, TG Foundation, and the Gilbert Foundation to do pre-tests and post-tests, and I'm pretty confident that I could look at any of you and talk about the writing gains that students face in the space of a month. But the state's broke. So the state, at some point, hopefully, will realize that an ounce of prevention is better than sending students to college or just giving them information that they don't do anything with when they're in high school. But with the mentoring program, I went to my then provost, who's now president, and I said, have I got an idea for you? I said, we can get more kids into college, and the way to do it is to use technology. So let's create a game. And if you give me money, I'll create this game. And he said, Bill, you don't know anything about technology, but you know a lot about content. So he said, I will give you money, but you've got to work with people who know something about technology. So, and Tracy well knows, I know nothing about technology. But the Game Innovation Lab in our School of Cinema is the best game innovation lab in the country, frankly. And it is a true interdisciplinary effort where we are working with the Game Innovation Lab, my center, and the School of Engineering in terms of the research emphasis. And we have an IES grant where we're trying to not only build games, but we're also evaluating them through IES. Gates has given us money, so we're now creating 3 games. One of them deals with college going, Mission Admission. It will be on Facebook, live, free, for everybody, November 1st. We have a launch. Then we are creating a middle school game for kids to increase. This is not sort of open your head and throw information in. It's to increase strategies, to think about what does it mean to go to college? How do I create these sorts of things? And for the students we work with, they don't know that. They don't realize that sometimes they're behind the 8 ball for no reason other than that they're in this school. And these Richie Rich kids are in Harvard Westlake. So it helps them do that. We're evaluating it. I also find in my own life, as I get older, I need to really try to understand and narrow things down, so I've been doing more life histories. I have a life history coming out in the Review of Higher Ed, with somebody who I've spent an inordinate amount of time with, and the life history is about his life from senior year in high school to freshman year in college. I'm proud to say he's now a senior, about to graduate. But, you know, I think that we don't talk enough to listen, actually, to young people because they have amazingly rich inner lives. But if we don't listen to them, they're not going to say. So that's been an enriching experience, quite an exciting experience, and remarkable was that the What Works Clearinghouse asked me to chair a panel that Neil and some others were on in terms of what's a college-going culture. So I've really been sort of all over the map, and where I'm at now is with these games is I want to make them sustainable. What that means is that I'm talking to venture capitalists today. I didn't know what a business plan was 3 years ago. I don't know how to talk to venture capitalists, but I've had to learn. And I've had to learn because I recognize that if I want these games to move forward, that's what I got to do. So 4 last points in terms of what are the fundamentals for me in terms of doing research. It's got to bring about change. It's got to be theoretically informed. It's got to be methodologically rigorous, and it's got to be fun.
That's great. Thank you. So, you know, it is easier to make sense of what we've done in the past, this perspective, but for people moving forward, what advice would you have for people trying to build a coherent program of research as you're going?
I think that I think it's important to move forward on a couple of paths. First of all, knowing what's going on at a policy level to understand some of the issues that are cropping up, what policymakers are asking, what kinds of questions they're asking. You can't really bring up research that answers questions if you don't know what the questions are in the first place. I think that's very important. A lot of the work we do is fairly short-term because of the way that we operate and the funding that we take. So we may be following a study that is for 1 year long, 3 years long at the most. And we always end our reports with questions and recommendations. And I find that a lot of graduate students and others actually have taken the questions that we've proposed out there so that they had the time to make it into their dissertation. When they have the time to actually focus on some of these things individually, not something we really welcome because we know that the word needs to get out there. There's a lot of good research happening based on some of the work that we've done. We also see from our perspective program evaluations. It doesn't sound sexy, but the fact of the matter is that many of these funders, like Gates and Lumina, have put millions and millions of dollars into particular interventions and other types of activities for community colleges, minority-serving institutions, and others who have been doing some very interesting work, innovative models on how to help students who are first-generation students and programs in place at minority-serving institutions. Well, when the funding runs out, what happens next? And I think it would be really helpful for people to help follow that up so that we know what really did happen. Because oftentimes the first year is a setup year, the next year they're learning lessons, and by the third year they may be getting some outcomes, but not really what you need to then justify more funding or change on campus. So I think it's really important for researchers to think about not just policies on the level of government, state and federal government, but also on institutional level. If you can see whether these types of efforts have created change on campus and whether that can be scaled up to other institutions as well.
That's great. Thank you.
I don't know anything about hockey. I do know that Wayne Gretzky was a great hockey player, and the sentence he said was, "Skate to where the puck is going to be." And I think that's what I've tried to do with my work, is I've tried to be sort of not behind the 8 ball, but sort of where are we heading, and trying to do work in that arena. The other thing is I'm pretty concerned about outcomes. I really want to affect change. When I've looked at some mentoring programs, they're all well-intended, they're all great people, and I mean that. But and it doesn't have to be what we do, but if our program doesn't get kids into college, I don't care if, they make me feel good or they feel good or something, but that's what I want. And I don't want to just get them into college, I want them to graduate. So, and that's sort of, I think we got to focus on that when we do things.
That's great. We're just about out of time. I guess the only other part that I would add is I think, when I think about these issues, is just, the works that I'm most proud of are the ones that I've spent the most time thinking about the underlying theoretical perspectives and really taking the time to know the literature and just invest, as well as persist through. So my one manuscript that I'm most proud of was rejected twice before it was published. So I think persisting through and working through the challenges of doing the research to try to understand, well, what are the policy relevant questions and important questions to ask, and how do you think about having measurable outcomes and really understanding how a program works and what the contributions to knowledge of looking at that might be. So thank you for your attention. Hopefully this was at least somewhat useful. Thank you to the panelists. I appreciate your being here.
Okay.